So anybody who's coming into that martial art with, if you want to understand that the historical tradition, you need to recognize that that's a basis, a foundation that people are coming into the art with. And so I feel like one thing I'm obligated to do as a teacher now, if I want people to understand the traditional art, I have to catch them up on years and years and years of wrestling that they've missed because they didn't start wrestling when they were kids.
Yeah.
And so the wrestling we're teaching also in the beginning, first level is really rudimentary wrestling. We're teaching people just, how to connect with their partner, collar and elbow kind of stuff. We're teaching them just basic moving, turning, spinning, some wrap ups, some basic holds, some basic arm locks. But a lot of it's just about getting this comfort being pushed and pulled. Like, it's just really it's like kids wrestling games level of stuff. And then as you develop, then we start to get into more standing wrestling, and then into a little bit of ground wrestling, though most of the European traditions until the sporting traditions are mostly standing wrestling. There's not as much ground combat other than how to get out and get back on your feet as quickly as possible.
Is it like in Canada, because I'm not familiar with Canada, but as you know, I studied in the United States, and the United States has a very big tradition of wrestling, right? Very big. It's like Iran and Russia, three powerhouses of wrestling. And does Canada have the same tradition of wrestling?
Not to the same degree. Meaning, you can do wrestling in some high school programs. You could do wrestling, and you could do wrestling certainly in university programs. But lots of high schools, certainly where I grew up, my high school didn't have a wrestling team, and that wasn't unusual. It wasn't. It's just, certainly there's a much stronger wrestling starting at the high school level in American schools. So it's less common for me to get students into a class in Canada that have some school wrestling experience. It's more common when I teach a workshop in the United States that my new students there may have done some wrestling in school. Yes. And that's a great bonus. Like, that really does help in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So, Canada is more like Europe, because in Europe, wrestling is also not big, right?
Right. Yeah, I think absolutely. Canada's much more influenced because of our, continued Commonwealth connection to the UK and that kind of thing. It was definitely more of a European feel.
Oh, okay. Okay, I understand. Okay, now coming back to the weapons you teach, could you tell us what kind of weapons you teach in your curriculum, in your school?
Sure, yeah. And I can show some of them to you as well.
Absolutely.
If you're interested. So here, I'll pop myself to my feet here. This is a two-handed longsword. So you see it's a simple cruciform sword, two cutting edges. This is a practice one, so it has a blunt on the end of it. And we typically refer to these as long swords now, but historically, the nomenclature we use now is not necessarily the same in the period. So they often just call this a sword that you can hold in two hands. But long sword for us describes everything from something that has a handle that's long enough that you can place two hands on it and still have some space, you have some leverage, but it also could refer to a slightly shorter handled sword where the hands can't be apart from one another, or even one where it's just like a slightly longer single-handed sword that you could grab the pommel to have a little more leverage or use single-handed. And long swords typically are weapons that can be used in two hands, but are also still able to be used in one hand. So the tradition for using the weapon, even a knight, we think uses uses a sword from horseback, but also uses it from the ground, uses it out of armor and in armor. And so this is a flexible tool in that I can still ride my horse and use this same sword effectively in one hand. Yes. I can dismount from my horse and use it to fight against unarmored opponents in two hands. And I can use it to fight against armored opponents being held at the haft. So it wasn't razor sharp. In fact, sometimes swords were even made with sections that were unsharpened to be gripped in the haft. So then it can be used a little bit more like a dagger. So it's a shortened sword, and it can be used to strike into weak places. And armor used as a tool for wrestling, because as we know, plate armor actually worked, couldn't cut through it. So you needed to seek weak points in the armor, use this as a baton for assisting in wrestling to get knights to the ground. So part of this is a noble weapon, again, because of its great utility. And certainly one thing that's popular to be seen on the internet was a certain amount of commonness is using the sword reversed as well. So there are even some swords, again, that had spiked pommels, spiked quillins. And the idea here being to be able to use the greater heft in the handle of the sword, again, in an armored fighting situation, or being able to use the sword to hook, using the quillons to hook the leg or the back of the neck of another knight. And then, of course, return to holding the sword. Sometimes called holding it long, back in two hands. So that's the flexibility of the two-handed sword. And again, this was also, it stayed within the tradition beyond the knightly era to be a weapon that was used for, it's not really a self-defense weapon. This is a much more of a battlefield weapon, or a sala, like an in-school fencing, a tournament and sporting weapon as well, later in the tradition. And some of them even get much longer handles that give you, again, greater leverage on the weapon. More of in the kind of knightly era as well, more within the self-defense orientation, this simple, again, a shorter handled cruciform sword. This is an arming sword. And so these are the ones that would be held and carried with you as a self-defense weapon. Whereas
was it used single-handedly or in conjunction with this shield or buckler?
Both.
Both.
So certainly most of the early manuals showing these swords are using them with a buckler. So I've got a buckler here as well. And so this is a concaved buckler. So this is made to channel points into the center of the buckler. And they were also made convex, so they had rounded edges, and sometimes square or even octagonal. And so we do the earliest European manual, which is a German manual, shows the sword and buckler together. And certainly when we look at medieval artwork, we see mostly this sword used with the buckler, but sometimes used alone. And so, if we were to think of it's funny nowadays in historical European martial arts, the longsword, the two-handed sword, is the most common. Yet historically, if we want to say the most people over the most time, sword and buckler. This is the most ubiquitous weapon combination in Europe.
Why is longsword so common in historical European martial arts? I always ask this question.
Right, I think it's really interesting, yeah. I'm a big lover of fighting sword and buckler. You and I, in fact, got some time to do some sword and buckler fighting. It was a real joy. And it shows up so much in so many different cultures.
Absolutely.
And the reality is that in the Middle Ages, most people fought with swords and bucklers in Europe. But most historical manuals in the Middle Ages were written for the two-handed sword as their primary weapon. And I think it's because of the audience. So the two-handed sword is a noble weapon, whereas this is much more of a soldier's weapon combination. And so if you want to, especially if you're selling to an upper class, they are a class that wants to be seen as apart from those that are beneath them, from peasant classes and middle classes. And so you have many more authors seeking to write to that audience. And so what are they writing about? They're writing about the knight's weapon. And then other tools that are within the knight's arsenal, like the pole arms, which were, again, tools initially used in armor. Even though we often think of pole arms as peasant weapons, they become adopted by the knightly classes as armor becomes more prolific, and then they become knightly weapons. And so again, those authors are writing for that audience. And because, well, that's where the money is, and it's also where the reputation is, where the fame is.
I have two questions. Does the European sword have religious symbolism, or as a cross? Does it represent a cross? Because back then people were not like we are today. They were religious, right?
Right. Yeah, and certainly it does. I don't think, you do a lot of weapons research as well, so you could speak to this subject. I certainly don't think that its cross-like nature that made it so. But certainly we have lots of different authors in the time that refer to the longsword being a cross. So I think that, in the chicken or egg kind of thing, it's certainly a sword first, cross second, but the significance of it being a cross was certainly not lost on people from that time. And so that shows up in the historical fighting literature as well, the part of the speaking to the godliness of the martial art.
Okay, that's very interesting.
And so, yes, certainly now the tradition is very secular, but historically it was not.
Devon, you as an experienced martial artist, I need to ask you this. In Europe sometimes, especially when you go to Eastern Europe and you talk to them, many of them, as we both know that once we use weapons which are, I mean, I am not into, you know that we both like fighting, you know, I don't want to use it as an excuse, but anyhow, when we do not use sharp weapons, the nature of the fight changes, right? It is, you know, it's not like empty-handed, you know, for example, I come from full contact Kyokushin, and I like contact, but still, no matter how much contact you allow, it's not a sharp weapon. But in Eastern Europe, the people I've seen, especially in Eastern Europe, they prefer longsword because they say, you can create lots of force and no sword and buckler has a chance against us. And I always say, God, you create lots of force because it's a banging instrument, right? Because it's not a sharp sword. You would never, ever fight against the guy with a sword and buckler who is wielding sharp weapons. You will be much more careful. You're not going to use it like a baseball bat. I don't know if you agree with me, you know, because
absolutely. Well, you know, one of the things that I totally, I have the same frustration, and it's in modern HEMA. One of my, you know, there's definitely, this isn't unhistorical either. There were distinctions in the period that these things were being done. There were divergent sporting forms of these arts then, as there are divergent sporting forms of wrestling in most traditions. And the context again changes the techniques that are being applied. And so here nowadays you get this, people say, yeah, you know, I want to have this powerful force multiplier. But the reality is like one thing I put in historical grounding with simple sort of thought experiment I put to people is to say, okay, swords are quite expensive to produce, okay? Especially historically because of the artisan requirements to make them. And so a sword is an expensive tool. So if you use the sword like you use the big stick, like if a sword was essentially a bludgeoning tool, why would you waste your money producing swords? Because if bludgeoning, if force is the secret of the sword, you might as well just make big sticks because they're way cheaper. And whereas the power that the sword has is that it actually can do a lot of damage with significantly less force. So that means, you know, not that the power, you know, you can use the leverage of the sword to create force, but it also just creates acceleration. And acceleration makes the weapon can make it very dexterous, and two hands can make the weapon very dexterous. And so that, to me, the power, the reason swords were used on the battlefields more, you know, by the noble class and revered more by the noble class than big sticks was because they could hew with to use the German word that's actually used for cutting, they can slice and cut with significantly less work. And so that means that you can easily outposition yourself over someone who must generate tons of force.
That's right.
And so, you know, like you're saying, against, you know, if you think of that sword and buckler situation, and to be honest, in a fight for my life, I'd much rather take a sword and buckler into that fight with the guy with the long sword than another long sword.
Could you tell me, could you expand on that, please? It's very interesting for me, excuse me, because, you know, I had this discussion a lot with Eastern European colleagues, right? Because, you know, they say, you know, I just said, okay, look, I'm forget this fighting. I'm a researcher. The question is this: if a weapon is that effective, let's stick to European context, then everyone would have only wielded a longsword. Why did they have other weapons at the same time? It doesn't make sense to me. But they didn't listen. They kept saying, no, because you can create lots of force. You can see it in competitions today. A sword and buckler guy has no chance against us. I said, guys, this is just a simulation. This is not a real sword fight. But, you know, and I don't know, excuse me, I don't want to be, maybe it was because of, I don't know, maybe because they were not that fluent in English. I don't know if we were crisscrossing each other because, you know, because maybe they were not very fluent in English. I don't know. But it was something which I was really frustrated because I said, that's the reason, because you're an expert in European arts. Please, could you explain this? That's very interesting because you would rather, you said that a sword and buckler would be your choice. Could you explain this, please? It's very important.
I think that, so, you know, I think we have to recognize that the two-handed sword, especially in a tournament context, is becomes a, you know, even though I just talked about the versatility of the two-handed sword, in this environment, it's used in a very specific way, in a very narrow set of techniques, and in a circumstance that is very controlled. And to me, in that environment, the sword and buckler actually has a greater amount of versatility. And I'd say the advantage that the longsword has for it is being long. It may be longer, than your single-handed sword. But it again has this restriction. If you're seeking, if this person's trying to use a lot of force, so they're thinking, I want to have it in two hands so I can generate a lot of force. Well, necessarily, I'm restricting the reach by having two hands on the weapon. I can't reach as far as I could with a single hand on the weapon. So one thing that's useful to think of, yes, this is longer, and I think that could be a bit of an advantage, but most people are going to limit that advantage by keeping the sword in two hands. And so I can actually equalize that advantage, because with the single-handed sword, I can reach significantly farther because I'm holding it in only one hand. So I can actually equal the reach of most long swords when I need to. But I like the thing that I would say back to, again, the sharp sword encounter, with the long sword, if I'm going to choose to strike into a low target, I must necessarily expose my head, right? So I've got two hands on the sword. I could cut this way and protect my head with the two-handed sword, but I can't reach very far. So if I want to cut to a low target, I'm going to have to expose my head because only the sword is there to protect me. Whereas with the buckler, I can strike into a low target while keeping the head safe. So tactically, the things that I like against a longsword fighter is that I can reach to a significantly greater area of tactical options, which means that the longsworder has to be concerned about a much wider area to defend. Whereas I can use the support of the fact that I have two tools to keep me defended in different ways, even while I'm seeking to strike to these different targets. So I find often against the sword and buckler person, against the longsworder, is able to open up the fight into a much wider area, which is difficult for the person with two hands on the sword to keep up with. And then against the power, there's a few ways that we meet power with sword and buckler, and I think this is probably very similar in the Persian tradition. One is don't be there. So if they want to come with lots of power, I'm going to just not oppose the power directly. The other is certainly of sword and buckler. Within the European traditions, there are lots of meetings where you use both together. And so I can form the same triangulating structural support against a blow with the sword and buckler, that I would, against a two-handed sword. So if I need to sustain a powerful downward blow, I can use the two weapons together. And then I also, again, have this flexibility that because I can use the two apart, I'm more set up to enwrap weapons, to conduct disarms, and to fight in close. So I think that there's just a greater, in this context, in this kind of dueling context in particular, I think the sword and buckler just has more flexibility. And certainly in my experience, but being a more experienced, I'm an experienced longsword fighter and sword and buckler fighter. And I think a lot of people in the European schools, because it's not covered so much, I think a lot of people just aren't very good with sword and buckler, to be honest. And so if you're not very good with it, of course, somebody who's better than you with a longsword will beat you. But if, taking two people that have similar expertise, I think that this is quite a challenging weapon combination to fight against with a two-handed sword.
Okay. Before we move on to other weapons, could you do me a favor and show our viewers some techniques with the long sword and some techniques with sword and buckler, please?
Sure, yeah.
I would really love to. I'm sure all viewers would love to see you showing that.
Yeah, my pleasure. Just a second here, I'm just going to adjust. Okay. I'm in such a bright place here that the light keeps getting kind of blown out on me.
No, it's okay.
See if I can adjust that.
Okay.
So with the long sword, so this is a weapon that, again, I was mentioning, it has kind of two, within the Italian tradition, has two forms of fighting. One is called gioco largo, which means wide play. And so wide play has a lot of very open types of actions, and has a lot of entering, exiting, re-entering. And the wide play part is that our tactical stratagem is to clear the center line, to clear the opponent's weapon, provoke defense, strike to other places. And so it also tends to have a lot of deception that is seeking to draw the opponent to make wide defenses. So I'm coming very broadly. There's a deception, attacking to a new place to make them chase, attacking in a way that intentionally misses, then striking and exiting. So it is this sort of breadth of play. And so as you see, as I move through some of these different forms and patterns, or even here to you, so there's a feint, there's an earnest attack, clearing, cutting and entering. It has this breadth to it. There's then narrow play.